Hi there, welcome back to another Bobeats review. Today is an exciting day because we are taking a look at the Polyend Play. Get ready for a quite long review, because the Polyend Play has been such an interesting piece of gear to review. I've used it basically every single day for a month during my vacation, and even though it has obvious limitations and the specs alone aren't that impressive, it's still one of the most interesting Grooveboxes that I've tried so far. For today's review, I've teamed up with Perfect Circuit and we are doing a giveaway of a Polyend Play together. Perfect Circuit is a great US-based store for all your synth and Eurorack needs. Especially their Eurorack module selection is huge, so go and check them out. And if you want to win a Polyend Play, join our giveaway, it's linked in the description, but unfortunately it's for US only. Back to the Polyend Play. What makes it so interesting? Well, it's definitely not the specs. It's only an 8-track mono sample player, no sampling capability and no time stretching. I mean, we've seen that sort of limited sample player before, right? With, for example, the Digitact and the model samples. So it's nothing like a deluge, which is more like a workstation, but Polyend doesn't market the Play as a workstation either. It's marketed as a Groovebox. And let me tell you, and I'm not exaggerating here, it's pretty great at helping you to get a groove going. I want to start today's video with a TLDR for anyone who isn't nerdy enough for a 40-minute in-depth video. So what is the Polyend Play? Well, it's an 8-track sample-based Groovebox. It also has 8 MIDI tracks. It comes with an SD card that is loaded with a bunch of sample packs, and the samples are played back in mono. If there's one thing you need to know about the Polyend Play, it is that it's very quick to create a beat and also to change it up. So the sequencer on the Polyend Play is one of the absolute fastest that I've ever used to generate an idea. The Polyend Play also has a basic song mode that lets you sequence through patterns sequentially like this. Another quite unique thing about the Polyend Play is the performance mode. So you have a performance layer with a lot of performance effects that you can apply to the entire beat or just select tracks. More about that later in today's video. The Polyend Play also has master effects. These are presets, so you can't go in and change settings for the different presets, but you have a reverb, delay, those are send effects. You also have settings for sound, limiter and saturations, which all together helps you shape the sound, but there's no advanced sound shaping possibilities here on a master level. And when we're talking about changing the individual samples, we have overdrive, we have the reverb and delay send, we can set the start and end points of samples, the sample attack and decay. There's also a low pass and high pass filter with resonance, but there's no dedicated filter envelope. In terms of sample memory, you can load 6 minutes of samples into the working memory of the unit, and there is no way to stream samples from the SD card. So that's something to keep in mind. What do I think about this? Well, I mean, I'm used to the Digitact. It also has a very small sample memory. 6 minutes is absolutely enough to make a full song on it using one-shot samples. But of course, if you start loading very long samples, that will be a limitation. And yes, you can create chords and play polyphonically on the device, both on the MIDI side and the sample side, but that will eat up tracks. So you have to select multiple tracks. Say if you want to do a 3-note chord, that's 3 of the tracks, 3 of the voices of polyphony for the samples, and 3 of the tracks for the MIDI side as well. So keep that in mind. Yes, it can do polyphonic stuff. Yes, it's a bit limited. So the TLDR is a really fun and exciting sequencer, but with slightly more limited sound shaping possibilities if, for example, you compare it to, say, the Digitact. On the Digitact, you can definitely do more sound design, whereas on the Polyend Play, it's more about the immediacy and the creativity of the sequencer and how you can generate ideas with it. So more about all of this in today's video. So let me start with the first thing that I really like with the Polyend Play, and that is its unique approach to sequencing. So it's a step sequencer. Here we have 16 steps. You can have 64 steps in total in one pattern. There's also variations, which is basically patterns within patterns. And here we have the 8 tracks, and you select them like this. But as soon as you're ready to put down your first sample is where it gets interesting and different. So we select using these knobs here. They're touch capacitive, and I'll talk about that. I'll touch on that later as well. And you select sample. Here we have the sample and the folder. Use these buttons here to select. So here we have different folders, effects, bass, hi-hat, keys, kick. So let's start with the kick. I like this one. Now I've selected the kick. So wherever I put it, it plays. The tracks are not locked to one sample. You pick and you place it wherever you want. Let's find some snares and claps. Some hi-hats. So we picked some samples, placed them on the grid, and now if I want to, for example, keep working on the kick track, I have to go back here into sample, go to kicks, and select whatever kick I want and place it. Or I could just copy a step. I hold it down and it turns purple. Look. That way I copy it, or I can even select multiple ones and hit copy, select a new track, and shift copy to paste them. So it's very easy to copy stuff around on the grid, but a drawback is that it can be a little difficult knowing what is what. So for example, if I want to know what a sample is, the easiest thing is just to hit Shift, press it, and now if I select sample, you can see which one it is, and then hit Shift again to deselect. But the tracks are still tracks, and if you want to affect an entire track, you just select it like this, or select multiple ones. So if we want to apply some reverb on the snare, we just select the snare track, increase the reverb. And now let's add a bass. Now I want it to run slower, so I'll select this track here, I'll go into tempo, and here you can set individual track speeds for each track. So let's do half the speed. Let's go into sample. Let's find as a bass. And if we hit view, we get a little keyboard. Let's find a little piano sample. Let's change the speed. Let's add some overdrive to the bass. Let's change the bit depth of the bass. Let's add some reverb to the piano. Let's add some delay. Now what this sequencer does really well is giving you an overview of all the 8 tracks and all the steps and the samples placed at once. And this is fairly unique. Most step sequencers require you to actually go into and select and go into a track to see what's going on. This has one advantage, and that comes when you start to do polyrhythms. Now to show you this, I've erased the hi-hats. We're going to use the fill. So fill basically lets you fill the sequencer with either random notes. You can also do Euclidean. You can do different types of beats, basically different types of patterns. And here you can see garage, hip hop, for example, house. So we could just do random, say 70. So let's start by changing the track length from 16 steps down to 14. And now we have a clear representation of how the individual tracks loop. Now let's add some percussion. Let's fill. Let's also randomize sampling folder. You hit save to apply. Let's do texture. Sample length. And to make it more interesting, let's change the length. Now let's select 2 of the steps here and let's go into repeat, which basically are different kinds of repeats of the sample. Now there's a ton of other sequencer functions here that I haven't mentioned. For example, if we select a track here, we can select a different play mode. Basically, if it's going forward, backwards, or in some weird sort of repetition or rhythmic variation. And what's really cool is that we can change up the entire, say, drum part of the sequence using different play modes by selecting all the tracks that we want here. You can have all of them or just a couple. So now I've selected the percussive tracks, and now we can change the play mode for these tracks while we're playing. can go back. And I think this is brilliant. Now I mentioned that you can have up to 64 steps per track. So you basically hit shift and press these buttons here. And now we're lengthening the current track here to more steps. You could also just select it and go here to track length and decrease or increase as you see fit. There's also mutes and solos. And variation. So if I hit variation here on the percussive track, you can see that we can have different patterns within patterns. So this is one we started at. Let's go here. And now we have a new pattern for the track. So let's put down some. Let's go back. And variations are kind of cool because if you hit variation on all the tracks here, you can basically mix and match between different variations of all the tracks. It's quite similar to the workflow of, say, Ableton or Machina, where you can mix different patterns together to see which ones work nicely together. It's also very clear that there has been a lot of attention to detail. So if I play something here and press master volume like this, just touch it, it cuts the audio. So that's just a nice little touch. So now that we have this little beat running here, I want to talk about the second thing that I think makes the play really interesting, and that is how quickly you can just change up a pattern from this to something totally different. So let's go into pattern view. And now by holding this pattern and pressing down somewhere else, we can just copy it over like this, for example. So now we have a copy of the same pattern. And if we press save, we've saved the state. So if we hit shift and save, it resets back to that state, which is always handy if we don't like the changes. So I've touched on a few of these things briefly in the first segment, but let's go deeper. So if I select a track with the kick drum and I choose randomize, there's a ton of things I can randomize. For example, sampling folder. This is why it's very important that kicks are in the kick folder, snares are in the snare folder, and so on. You also have sample in pool, basically any sample. So for example, and if I hit save, it will apply this randomization. But of course that's a little crazy. So let's do sampling folder. We can also add texture, which I think is like a random amount of overdrive. Maybe it has something to do with the filter, I'm not entirely sure. So let's add some overdrive to the snare. Let's change the filter, so you can do low pass, high pass, and there's also resonance. We can also apply a repeat type. So for the snare here, I've put ARP down. And I don't want it playing all the time, so I'm going to chance, setting it to 60% of the time. I'm doing high pass on it. And I want to make some variation to the keys and the bass, so I'm just going to copy the keys over here and the bass over here. And here as well. And I don't want the percussions to take up so much room, so what I can do is I can change the sample end to make them snappier. want to change the panning a bit more. So let's go back to the old pattern. So as you can hear, quite a big difference from just changing a few things kind of quickly. And you can also introduce, for example, swing. This kind of nice swing per track. So kind of exaggerated there on the percussion, but still kind of nice. And let's say I want to create a variation of this pattern using the play mode. So here we can select the play mode, and I think I have one in mind. Trigger. Kind of nice. Yeah. So now we created an entirely different pattern by just selecting a few tracks and changing the play mode. I mean, it's so fast and it's so easy. Sometimes it gets kind of weird and sometimes it's just super interesting. You can definitely make most types of electronic music on the play, but I tend to gravitate towards the little bit more minimalistic stuff. And I think it's something to do with the design and the sequencer that really lends strengths to those kind of styles of music. Another big positive is how portable the Polyend Play is. Not only is it a very slim device, it fits in a bag very easily, but you can power it over the USB port using, say, an Anker battery. I'm not sponsored by Anker in any way, but I do find that their batteries are really good. I basically didn't use the Polyend Play hooked up to wall power during all of summer. I just used this battery here and it worked really, really well. Now, speaking of being portable, does it work outside? Well, yes and no. How well does the Polyend Play work outdoors in decent sunlight? Well, I'd say not great. The screen is pretty visible, but it's more so the pads. You can't actually see which ones are lit and which ones are not. So it can be quite difficult to use it in direct sunlight. And I have set the grid brightness to high. So that's what you're seeing here. So you can definitely use it outside on the go, but in direct strong sunlight, it's not something I would recommend. Another limitation that we have to talk about is the fact that you can only get audio out of the device through the stereo output. There is no way to save individual tracks on the device. There's no multi-tracking over USB, for example. And especially multi-tracking over USB would have been really useful. I have a lot of ideas in this device that just won't sound great if I record them as stereo audio. So if Polyend could add USB audio multi-tracking, that would be amazing. Or some way to just export your track, maybe the song sequence that you've laid out, exporting that as stems. That would be really good. The next thing I want to talk about and that I really like are the performance effects. So we are in the pattern. If you hit perform, you have a bunch of live performance effects that you can apply to the entire pattern or just select tracks. So for example, this row here affects all tracks even if none are selected. But the rest here require you to select a track, so I'm selecting all for simplicity's sake, but you can of course just pick, say, the rhythm part or the melodic part. And here we have pitch, and here are filter settings, and here are bit reduction settings. These ones here are basically on the fly changes to the play mode, changing up how the pattern is being played. Whereas these three here changes up more of the sound. So here we can do some pitch changes, for example. Here we can do effects changes. And yes, you can combine different effects together. So the performance layer here is a ton of fun to use. It's a really unique feature. It's something that I'd like to see Electron, for example, get inspired by. It's just a ton of fun. But when we're talking about the performance effects, there's one thing I really dislike, and that is that you cannot record changes to the performance effects into the sequencer. So what do I mean by that? Well, imagine that you have a groove going, you're playing, you're making changes. There's no way to save that other than recording it as a stereo pair. Imagine instead that you have some sort of effects track where you could record changes, whatever you're pressing here, into the sequencer. And that could be its own little sequence. You know, you could create wild variations like... and have that performance data recorded somehow. I think that would be a really good inclusion. And also, these performance effects are not available for the MIDI side of things. If you press here, there's nothing. I have been talking to Polyend. They are saying that they're working on performance effects for the MIDI side. Oh, and one last thing, when I was speaking to some other early adopters, early users of the Polyend Play, many of them brought up the fact that it would be amazing if we could actually change these performance effects. This is something you can do, for example, on the MC707 that has similar style performance effects. You can change them. You can create your own. These are preset. You can't change them as is. And I think because it has a great screen, a good menu system, I think you could add more customizability to the performance effects, to the master effects, for example, without changing the philosophy of the device. Now, this far in the video, we've only talked about the Polyend Play as a standalone Groovebox, but it has another side to it, and that's the 8-track MIDI sequencer side. But before we talk about that, here's a word from the channel sponsor DistroKid. Here's 5 reasons to try out DistroKid. Firstly, you sign up for about $20 a year and you can upload unlimited amounts of music. Secondly, it's really quick and easy to upload. Basically, anyone can do it without any prior knowledge. 3, there are different tiers of subscriptions, so if you want to release your music under, say, different artist names, or if you're starting a label, DistroKid has an option for you. 4, DistroKid lets you upload to relevant stores and streaming services such as Spotify and iTunes, and it doesn't take long for the music to be available in the stores. 5, there's also the hyperfollow feature, which automatically creates a custom page where people can find out where to buy or listen to your music, and I personally really like this feature. So if you, unlike me, happen to finish some music with your synth setup, be sure to use DistroKid to upload it. So far I've only talked about using the Polyend Play as a standalone Groovebox, and that is because it's how I've used it almost 90% of the time. I haven't really gotten that deep into the MIDI side, and it's probably just a preference thing because it's a very capable MIDI sequencer. But it's also the side that is a little bit underdeveloped, and Polyend has said that they are working on updates for it. For example, there is no performance mode. So the performance mode that you've seen for the audio side is not present for the MIDI side. So how do you use it with external gear? Well, first up, you only have one MIDI output, and this is a clear limitation. I'm not sure why they put just one MIDI out. Since it's on a mini jack, they could have easily put more. But I'm using this Kenton here to split the MIDI signal so I can connect it to 2 pieces of gear or more, up to 5 with this box here, but there are bigger through boxes. You select what MIDI channel to use, either the jack channels or the USB channels, so you can have it connected via USB at the same time. And channel number 1 is the Hydra synth. And then you can put down steps like this. You can also set the length, the note length. So we can go here, set a longer note length. We can then select the pulsar. And we can of course add something from the sampling side. So fill, let's do hi-hat, let's do electro. Let's select these 3 tracks here. So here I've set up 2 CC messages. So these are for 2 different filters on the Hydra synth, and basically what you do is you go into the menu here, and here under MIDI you have CC mapping, and then you have per channel mapping, which is really nice. So you can have different CC setups per channel. So for channel number 1 here, you can see here these are labeled CC cutoff resonance. It doesn't mean that you have to have them set to cutoff or resonance. It basically means that it's this knob here. So this is the CC cutoff and resonance knob, and then you go in here and you set it up to different CC values. And yes, you can create chords and play polyphonically on the device, both on the MIDI side and the sample side, but that will eat up tracks. So you have to select multiple tracks. Say if you want to do a 3-note chord, that's 3 of the tracks, 3 of the voices of polyphony for the samples, and 3 of the tracks for the MIDI side as well. So if we want to do a 4-note chord, for example, we select 4 tracks, and then you hit live record and play, and then you can record into it. But there's no metronome. This is something I would have wished for. There's also no count-in, which I would have loved to have. It's something personally that I really like, because it gets kind of tedious to have to listen through a whole beat if I want to start on the first beat, start recording on the first beat. But let's use a hi-hat as a metronome, and I'm putting this sequence here to half speed. So if I want to start on number 1, I have to wait. If I want to change, say, the filter here for the first chord, I will just use Shift, select these tracks, and then deselect, select the second one, deselect, and select these ones and do something different. There's also similar randomizations and chance features from the Groovebox, the sample side of things. You can also do micro movements of steps. You have different repeat types. And we do have the same ability for the MIDI side to set the different track speeds, for example, or track length. So all in all, I think that the MIDI side is very capable, but it's not something that I've dived super deep in, and I also feel like there's a lot of updates that might be coming down the road to improve it even more. Here's another negative that we have to talk about, the touch capacitive knobs. Let's say I want to change a setting here. Oh, whoop. You can see, because I'm not holding it all the time, it's very easy that it jumps between the two values here. That's because of how sensitive it is. It's also very easy if I'm turning one thing to accidentally hit something else. Maybe they can add a setting so you can change the sensitivity to something that works for you. And just to reiterate, I'm not alone in feeling that this is way too sensitive. It's like one of the most common complaints that I hear from my viewers.
What's good, guys? So I wanted to quickly talk about the Polyend Play, and I want to talk about how much I truly enjoy it as an instrument. I am not by any means a colored box, square, light, Groovebox type of a person, but I have an affinity for the Play. But I do want to say there is one thing on the Polyend Play that drove me insane when I first got it. I really like the ability to touch a knob, but it is so sensitive. And especially when you have double tap turned on, you can click the wrong parameters all the time. You just brush one of the knobs and it comes up. So what I want to say is you can fix that by going into the menu and selecting knob double tap and turn it off. Yeah, it's on by default. So go in, do that. Now, while I still use these two buttons and this knob, and specifically because this knob is detented, so you have a bunch of little clicks on the encoder, that's how I like to use Play, because it's a lot easier to select exactly what I want parameter-wise. So yeah, anyways, thank you, Bo, for having me come on and talk about my one little gripe about the Polyend Play. I think it's a fantastic Groovebox. Like, I'm not that kind of a person, and I love to just use it. It is that much fun. So anyways, I know if Bo's making a video, he clearly feels the same way. So I guess I'll send it back to him.
Here are my final thoughts about the Polyend Play. It's amazing for performing and coming up with new ideas, or taking old ideas and changing them into something new. It's basically a super creative device that I think can spark a lot of creativity within you. Its biggest limitation, however, is when you want to finalize something that you've made on it. I, for example, have 2 finished tracks on it, and it's difficult to mix them properly on the device, and it's difficult to get them out of the device because there is no multi-tracking, for example, or a way to save stems. But don't get me wrong though. The Polyend Play is amazing and I really love it. It has quickly become an absolute favorite of mine, and that's quite rare when it comes to Grooveboxes, because that's a category of products where few have made the cut. For example, I absolutely think that the Deluge is an amazing workstation, but it didn't really work for me. And while I think that the MC707 has one of the best synth engines in the game, yeah, I don't use it that much. I use the Machina Plus, the Digitact, and more recently the Syntact. Those are my go-to devices, and they are now joined by the Polyend Play, which I foresee that I will be using a lot on the couch at home, while traveling, and also in the studio sequencing other synths, and in particular I think my Eurorack. So, Polyend set out to make a Groovebox sequencer hybrid, and I think that they very much succeeded at that. Now it just needs a bit more of polish to be perfect, but I think they can manage that. So that was my Polyend Play review. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want me to make these long form reviews and you want to support me in that endeavor, be sure to check out my Patreon. It's linked in the description. Have a great day. Talk to you later.